Now we have tackled the texturing of the landscape, let's take a look at the scatter. And, we did talk a little bit about this last week, but I thought it would be worth taking a look at some of the setups more in depth. The first thing we need to do is bring in our pines and our heather for scattering. But one thing that is clear is that this scene is too small at the moment. If I switch to a side view and take a look, now generally these hills should be about 600 meters high, so we are about 3 or 4 times too small. So let me just scale this whole thing up just at the end here. This may have some effect on our displacements, but we can just crank up the intensity to accommodate that. That's probably better. That takes us to about 600. And of course our camera will now be in the wrong place, so I'll just have to readjust this. As my camera is animated, I'll probably, just for the purposes of this video, create a new one. And I'll make sure that it's set to the same 1920 by 803. Okay, this is roughly the same. I'm happy with this for now. Let me double check the render to see if we get roughly the same result. Okay, so as I thought, we will probably need to crank up the displacement, but for the moment, I'll just leave this and we'll take a look at the scatters. So let's put down an instance node and set this to fast point instancing. And if we go inside, we want to object merge in the mountain. Again, I have added a null on the end with the name out, just so I know exactly what I want to bring in. Okay, so now we want to build our scatters. Let me just have a better look. So I will drop down a VOP, another attribute VOP, and jump inside. Okay, so the first thing I want to stop this doing is going above a certain height. So I'll drop down a float to vector. Sorry, a vector to float. And take the P, drop down a range, and plug this in here. Now I want the highest point to be about 370 meters and clamp this to 260. I don't want the trees growing too high, and this was the numbers that I came up with that gave me the best result. Okay, now I also don't want them to come in too low either, so let me just duplicate this. And I'll use a multiply to join these together. Let me just fix this for now. And I can make this a little smaller maybe even below 1. I think this dips just below the grid. This is probably fine. And let me just multiply this back on top. And invert this. Okay, so now we have these pine trees not growing too low and also not growing too high. We could also have used the dirt mask, as that is what we created for the dirt next to the river, but this will work just fine too. I also don't want them to grow on any of the rock, so I will bring in the bedrock. And since everything in this bedrock is white for the rocks and black for, the grassy areas, I will first need to invert this so I can multiply it on top. And I have just used this complement. This just inverts the numbers here. And I'll do the same with the sediment, as I don't want this to grow in the areas that are wetter. Let me put down a range just to make sure we get enough contrast here. Nice. The final thing I want to do is remove any of the density from the faces that are pointing away from the camera. So I know that the camera is facing this way, down the valley. So I can just use the x-axis here from the normals to do this. So another vector to float. And let me take the x. You can see what we get here if I just clamp these. What we are doing is removing the white from everything that's facing this way. And I can multiply this on top. Again, this is just to optimize it a little so we don't get any trees growing on the backside. That we will never see. Obviously, I do not want pine trees growing all over the place here, so let's break this up with some noise. That's probably fine. Let me just clamp this some. And again, multiply this on top. Cool, so now we have little patches of trees that will grow. Looks like I have shifted this camera by accident. Let me move it back. And if I want to control some of this, I have two ways to do it. I could put down a paint node and remove some of the areas that I don't like, or paint some in, and we will look at that in a second. Or I could just play with the offset here and try and get something that I prefer. So I'm happy with this. Just to cover our bases, before I move on, let me just export this as the new density So I'll just plug this in and type in density. And put down a scatter node. And density is already enabled here. I'll just remove the relax and crank up the total count. Now I will need a lot more than this. I'm just adding this in as a test for now. Let's leave it at 20. And before we attach in the instances, let's drop down this paint node, paint attribute, or should I say attribute paint. Bring in the density. And now we can add or remove to this if we want. I don't want to change this, so let's just remove this for now. This camera has moved. This time I think I need to lock it to make sure I don't move it by accident. This is why I locked it before. So let's bring in the pine tree, and I want to name this pine scatter and use an alembic to bring in the pine tree. Now this is because I processed the pine trees like we showed in week 4, where I brought them in, I applied the material, and I exported them as an alembic. So I'll call this one pine, oh, not pin, pine 0. Unpack, and I'll bring this guy in. Let me just make sure he is the right size. He should be about 30 meters. It is not the right size, so down to 0.3 should take it to the right scale. It's fine. And I will need to set up the textures, the shaders, and these are the paths that I need to create. So ShopNet Arnold Pine Trees and ShopNet Arnold Bark. If I had these in a different scene, I would just copy and paste them in. But just to get into the practice, I'll remake them again. So I will just bring in the rest of the trees and set up these shaders. Oh, it's pine trees, not pine needles. And like we spoke about in the look dev scene, I'll make sure to color these guys. Turn on subsurface. Give it some color. And switch on thin walled. Now, once I start to render this, I will need to go back and tweak some of these values, but this is fine for now. And I'll just make this bark a little brown. Okay, so we already set up our attribute VOP. Let me just copy and paste this in from our previous scene. This guy here. The only difference is I have gone ahead and also added the channel for the min scale as well as the max. So this is at 0.2 and 0.5. I just want to render this and see what it looks like. Pine tree, okay. Now I would be expecting to see the scatter here. Let me just find out why it's not showing. Because in the attribute wrangle, this is looking for pine tree. Let me just fix this. There we go. And I forgot to switch this into this object. I think that was what was causing my camera problems before. Okay, so let me just render this and see what we have. So as I mentioned, we will need to go back and adjust some of these colors as they aren't very appealing at the moment. And I'll paste this here just so we can change them both at the same time. And again, just to make this scene a little nicer, let me just crank the displacement back up on the mountain itself. Okay, so this was just a guess, but it's definitely working a little better. So let's bring in the heather. I think this is enough of a demonstration for the trees, and you can use this to set up your birch, your alder, and the other trees that you may have. I also haven't added the color variation here, but you can use the previous video to get an idea of how to add that here. And next, let's take a look at adding the heather. The scatter is very similar, but we just want to make sure that you understand some of the differences. So let me just copy and paste this instance, as a lot of the stuff will be the same. But for these guys, I want to add the scatter and then add some runs that go in between using the Voronoi noise. So let's jump inside. And I want some more patches of heather. So let me just reduce this some. Okay, and crank up the roughness. And this is just one, but I could do another scatter of a different color of heather just to blend these in between. And I want to add some, let me just see what this looks like through the camera. Play with this offset some. Okay, and I want to add a Voronoi noise below this, just so we can make those little river type shapes that we spoke about in a previous video. So you can see we get these lines coming through. And I will add a noise to the P position so we can change the irregularity of this line here. Nice, so that will add some cool interest. And that's enough for the heather. I just need to make sure this is pointing to the right location. And import it. This is probably still a little big, but we can judge this when we get to the scatter. In fact, in this case, we don't need this. And I can just plug this directly in the top. It's very small, so I'll probably need to crank this up. As we mentioned previously, the easiest way to do this is to pin the viewport before going into the scatter. On average, I tend to use anywhere between, or at least anywhere up to 6 to 700,000 per scatter. If I had to go any higher than this, I would either stagger it back in density and increase in size, or I would create another scatter and offset it a bit. Let me just check the shader required for this guy. Flowers light and leaves. I'll set these guys to something orange. I can probably leave them as they are for now. We can tweak them once we see them in the render. Okay, so we are missing a shader here. Let me find out why. Ah, Heather flowers light. Let's try that again. Nice. Let me take a look here. Now the colour is wrong. Let me try and match something a bit closer to the ground texture. That's a bit better. And of course we can mix this up with some other Heather colours and we can add some jitters to this. Okay, so the last thing I want to do here is add in the river. And I'm only going to do this with a grid. And create the water shader that we spoke about in one of the previous videos. So I want to set transmission to 1 and give it some color. Give it some scatter color. Increase the depth. And that should be fine. We can always judge it as we go. Another way to add a material to an object in the viewport is just to drag and drop it on. And I'll turn off the scatters for now, just so we can speed up the render. Okay, so let's adjust the shader a little bit. We, of course, want it to be glossy. And you can see what the depth is doing at the edges of the water. And we also want to add some bump to this. I'll just use a noise. And plug this in to the bump. And add this to the normal. Nice. we can take the scale down a bit. And this is just a really quick way to get some water. But this is fine for me. Let me just reduce this. Nice. Okay, so that's all I wanted to cover in this video, just so you guys can have a bit more of an insight into setting up the scatters. And in the next one, we'll take a look at the Megascans assets that were used in the promotional scene. And then we'll move on to talking about Cryptomats and finish up this. Thanks.